Although the title of this talk refers to Cromwell House, there have in fact been 3 Cromwell houses built on the same site in Mortlake over the past 500 years or so. But the one I am most interested in here is the impressive Victorian villa built by James Wigan. The Wigan family were the villa's only residents and lived there for some 60 years. But a little bit about the first Cromwell House. The original Cromwell House stood facing William's Lane, and its gardens stretched back to the river. It was described in the survey of the manor of Mortlake in 1617 as being a large house with outhouses, an orchard and gardens. The old Cromwell House had several owners over the centuries, including the Bristol slave trader Edward Colston. There was Sir Charles Howard and the Ainscombe family. Cromwell House's residents must have been very happy in the house, as they each remained there for many decades. They also made major alterations and additions to the house and grounds over the centuries. A gazebo was built into the garden wall, most probably by Colston, who had redesigned the gardens in about 1700. This gazebo overlooked the river so that residents and visitors could watch the activities on the Thames. The current brewery playing fields were a part of the Cromwell House estate from 1634 and were used for grazing. The first drawings we have are by the architect Porden in about 1800. This is the rear of the house, facing north towards the river. And this is the front, facing south. The last resident of Cromwell House, Valentina Ainscombe, died in 1841, but the following year the artist Sophia Brunel Hawes painted this watercolour. It shows a large room in the west wing that was called the Council Chamber. This room was said to have been used by parliamentarians, of which there were many in this area during the Civil War. This drawing from the 1850s shows the house empty and in poor condition. And this brings us to the Victorian house and the Wigan family. Old Cromwell House might have been derelict by this time, but the land it stood on must have caught the eye of James Wigan, the brewer. He bought the lease and requested permission for the old house to be demolished, and it was subsequently pulled down in 1857. Its foundations now lie within the brewery site. This map shows the position of both houses and their 3.5-acre grounds. James Wigan was born near Maidstone in Kent in 1832, the 14th of 15 children. He came from a family of wealthy hop merchants, and so it was not surprising that he became a brewer. In 1848, Charles John Phillips acquired Mortlake Brewery. He then took on the 20-year-old James Wigan as a partner in 1852. James, at this remarkably young age, took on the responsibility of the brewing process in what was already quite a large brewery. The local well-known company name of Phillips and Wigan was born. The brewer's initials can still be seen in brick roundels on the old wall of the brewery today, on the north side of Mortlake High Street. The brewery prospered under James and Charles and became an important source of employment for many of Mortlake's residents. This is a lithograph of the Queen's Head by Albert Betts. The brewery supplied the Queen's Head with beer, as you can see in this close-up of the sign. Phillips and Wigan entire fine old ales. But to return to the young James. In 1856, James Wigan asked the architect Robert Philip Pope to design a new Cromwell House in the existing grounds of the old house, but facing onto the river at Thames Bank. And this is one of Pope's architectural drawings of the house. It is now June 1858, and James has just moved into his newly built house by the River Thames with his new wife, Maria. James and Maria had married in St Mary's, Mortlake, in January 1858, when he was 26 and she was 20. Maria was born Maria Nichols in Blackheath in 1838. And this is the young James. These two photographs were taken at about the time of their marriage in 1858. Cromwell House was an impressive red brick Victorian villa with fine Tudor-style chimneys and 14 bedrooms. It was a modern home with mains drainage, WCs and gas lighting. Their first son, James Lewis, was born there in January 1859, and Maria and James went on to fill the bedrooms with their children, producing a further 12 over the next 23 years, all of whom were born in and brought up in Cromwell House. However, it seems remarkable that James Wigan chose to build his family home on Thames Bank at this time. There had been local cholera outbreaks in 1831 and in 1849. This second outbreak saw at least 22 deaths locally. The first death was just along Thames Bank by the ship in Prince's Court, with its overflowing privies and offensive drains. The medical officer reported at the time that the cholera was mainly attributable to the inhabitants drinking the water of the Thames, highly impregnated with the contents of the sewers from the court, and frequently also with the droppings from the manure barges unloading close to the spot. This photograph shows how near it was to the river. To add to the problems of local pollution, the new London Bridge had been built in 1832. Unlike the old London Bridge, the new structure allowed the tide to flow freely up to Mortlake and beyond. The high tide kept the city's sewage in the drains, but at low tide they poured their filth into the river. So once the tide started to come in again, the untreated discharged waste was carried upstream and continued to slop up and down with the tides as far as Teddington. It would have been extremely unpleasant along Thames Bank, especially in the summer. Despite all this, James moved into his house in June 1858, and James and Maria successfully brought up their 13 children, which must say a great deal about their fortitude and general health. A photograph of Williams Lane shows the carriage entrance in the distance and the main pedestrian gate in the foreground. This gate was moved in 1961 to its current position, some 100 metres further east. Despite their success, the Phillips and Wigan partnership broke up in 1877, and 12 years later the Mortlake brewery combined with Watney's. In 1898 the company of Watney, Coombe, Reed was formed, and although James was no longer associated with the local brewery, he continued to live in Cromwell House with his growing family. This drawing shows the brewery building as it was in the 1870s. But to return to the house. Cromwell House was extended in the late 1860s to include a new servants' hall and a larger kitchen. It had become a truly spacious home. On the top floor were 6 bedrooms for servants, with 2 box rooms and a WC. On the first floor were 8 bedrooms with dressing rooms, a nursery and 3 bathrooms with WCs. There were 2 staircases. The ground floor consisted of 4 reception rooms, a servants' hall, a butler's bedroom and other WCs. There was also a kitchen, scullery, pantry and larders. There were large cellars, including a separate beer cellar. The house had mains drainage and hot and cold water was available. It was a modern Victorian villa on a grand scale. The 1881 census gives us a snapshot of James and Maria's household. They had a governess, a nurse, a cook, 2 housemaids, 2 nursemaids, a kitchen maid, a butler and a footman, all living in the house, with a groom and coachman living in the lodge in the grounds. There would also, of course, have been many other servants who didn't live in. There were 13 children, as well as James and Maria themselves. I make that 25 people living in Cromwell House at the time. It is a shame that there are no known photographs of the interior of Cromwell House. However, by 1870 it is likely that it would have been opulently furnished, with boldly patterned wallpapers, carved and inlaid wooden furniture, damask soft furnishings, patterned carpets, a multitude of pictures and mirrors on the walls, and ornaments on all surfaces. Elaborate plaster covings and ceiling roses would have adorned all the major rooms, and there would have been many fine marble fireplaces. James' brother Frederick lived in Clare Lawn in East Sheen, and the interior of their house looked like this. This is the picture room at Clare Lawn. And this the study. There is no reason to believe Cromwell House did not look much the same. The extensive gardens of the house had lawns and a reputation for having some fine trees. There were tennis and croquet lawns, a kitchen garden, a conservatory, greenhouses and potting sheds. There was a boathouse. In the grounds was a lodge for the groom and footman, 2 stables, 2 loose boxes, a coach house and a harness room. And last but not least, a cowshed. This photograph of Maria shows her in middle age. Maria became a great friend of Princess Mary of Teck, who lived at White Lodge in Richmond Park. Together they supported local charities, including one for destitute governesses. And Maria could always persuade Princess Mary to open local charity bazaars. The princess was a rather large lady, and in Cromwell House there was an especially wide chair that was always known as the Duchess's chair, which she used when she visited the house. This is a photograph of James. taken in the late 19th century. One of James's sons, Algernon, was said to have organised the first running commentary to the Oxford and Cambridge boat race at the beginning of the 20th century. There was always a large party at Cromwell House for these events. Algernon linked the Cromwell House telephone with those of all the public houses along the route of the boat race, from the start at Putney. He then declared the progress of the race through a loud hailer to his guests, until the crews arrived outside his house at the finishing post. The somewhat makeshift telephone mechanism and some wires still exist today on one of the remaining walls of Cromwell House. This photograph shows James and his sons taken in about 1890 outside Cromwell House. The Wigan family was a deeply religious and generous family. They were regular attenders at St Mary's Parish Church, and James was a church warden there, as well as being treasurer of the Chancel Fund. Maria Wigan presented a window to St Mary's in memory of her brother, the Reverend Harmon Nichols. James Wigan died suddenly at Cromwell House on the 8th of March 1902. He was 70 years old. He had contracted pleurisy, but it was not expected to be fatal. However, his heart failed, and he died just a few days after becoming ill. James was buried in Old Mortlake burial ground. His obituary in the Brewing Trade Review described James as a kind man, with a fine presence and a remarkably impressive voice, who loved his work for its own sake, as well as for its good results. In 1905, the nave and south aisle of St Mary's Parish Church was completely reconstructed by the architect Arthur Blomfield, and the nave was rebuilt. There is a brass plaque on the west wall of the parish church which reads, "To the glory of God and in memory of James Wigan, for 50 years a helper in all good works in this parish." This nave was erected by his family, friends and some fellow practitioners. Easter 1906. Maria died in February 1918 in Cromwell House. She was 80 years old and had lived in the house for almost 60 years. By this time all the children had left home. The era of the Wigan family in Mortlake had come to an end. Above the west door of the parish church is a rather fine mosaic depicting the Nativity, which was given in memory of James and Maria by their sons and daughters in 1919. A year later, in 1920, Cromwell House and its contents were put up for sale. Just a few days after the sale, the house was opened to anyone who was prepared to spend 10 and 6 for a ticket to watch the 1920 Oxford and Cambridge boat race. The windows on the first floor would have given the best view of the winning post, and the proceeds from the ticket sales were given to charity. Cromwell House and its extensive grounds were bought by Watners in 1920. A caretaker, Albert Reeve, then lived in a part of the house with his family until it suffered bomb damage in 1942. The grounds had been added to Watney's Sports Club in 1928, and in 1939 the interior of the house was redecorated in case it was needed for billeting soldiers. In 1940, the local Defence Volunteers built a hut in the grounds of Cromwell House for the Chiswick Bridge Guard. Although Cromwell House was never lived in after 1942, there are many children who were known to play in its overgrown gardens, to scrump its apples, and even to get access to its cellars, and to play in the house itself. By this time, however, the lead had gone from the roof. The main staircase was in a perilous state, and most of the fittings and fireplaces had gone. This Cromwell House was finally demolished in 1947. It was barely 90 years old. In 1960, a third Cromwell House was built. This consisted of a terrace of 3 houses and was lived in by directors of Watney's brewery. To my mind, it was a miserable-looking building with little architectural merit, and, when only 30 years old, it was demolished in 1991. In 1992, Parliament Mews was built on the site, a modern complex of 14 houses. The only remains of the old Cromwell House are the gates, which were moved in 1961 and were also renovated just a few years ago. They can be seen on Williams Lane today. Otherwise, all that remains of the old houses are sections of the boundary walls. The brewery has now been sold, and all the existing buildings associated with it will be demolished, with a few exceptions, including the maltings, and the land will be built on. There will be an archaeological dig before any building begins, and I hope the remains of old Cromwell House will be discovered so that we can explore its footprint. I would like to finish with this watercolour by George Barrett Jr., which depicts a very rural Mortlake in 1820. It was painted before the bank was built up and shows the garden gazebo of the old Cromwell House in the distance and the walls of Mortlake Manor House. It illustrates how areas change over time, and the proposed development of the old brewery land will add a new layer of history to this area.